She was just a girl when they sold her to a husband older than her father, yet fate had other plans. Texas Hill Country, 1879. The land stretched wide and endless, baked under a sun that spared no one. Dust clung to every fence post and wagon wheel, and the cicadas screamed their endless song through the oak groves. A small farmhouse stood at the edge of the settlement, its roof sagging, its walls patched with mismatched boards. Inside, Mary Whitfield sat trembling, her hands clenched around the edge of her mother's shawl. She was 16, though the world had aged her faster, and her wide gray eyes carried the weight of a decision she had never been allowed to make. Her father's debts had grown too large, the crops had failed too many seasons in a row, and in the end, he sold his daughter the way a man might sell a mule. The buyer was a rancher named Thomas Harlan, a man of 60 with hair gone white and shoulders still broad. He had buried one wife and outlived 2 sons. What he wanted now was not love, but a girl to keep his house and bear his name, whether she wished it or not. The wedding was no wedding at all. No flowers, no vows spoken with trembling hope. Only a preacher muttering through the words, her father's hand heavy on her back, and Harlan's weathered face watching her with eyes like stone. When the preacher closed his book, it was done. She was a wife in name, though her heart screamed that she was nothing but a prisoner. The ride to his ranch felt endless. She sat stiff on the wagon bench, clutching her shawl as Harlan guided the reins in silence. His profile was carved deep with lines, his beard coarse, his hands calloused from years of work. He did not glance at her, not once, as if she were already a piece of furniture he had purchased. When the wagon rolled to a stop before a lonely homestead surrounded by miles of dry pasture, Mary's throat tightened. There was no laughter here, no warmth, only silence and wind. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of smoke and leather. A single chair sat by the hearth, a narrow bed against the wall, a table scarred with knife marks. It was a man's house, built for function, not comfort. He set down his hat, glanced at her once, then said in a voice rough with age, "Supper's on the shelf. Make yourself useful." And with that, he stepped outside, leaving her standing alone in the dim light. That first night, she lay awake on a straw mattress, listening to the sound of his boots moving across the porch. Fear clawed at her chest, each creak of the floorboards a reminder that she belonged to him now. When the door opened, she held her breath, but he did not come near. He set his rifle against the wall, lowered himself into the chair, and fell asleep by the fire without a word. The crackle of flames filled the silence, and in that strange reprieve, she felt both relief and dread. Days fell into routine. She swept the floors, cooked what little she could from his pantry, mended shirts with trembling hands. He worked the cattle, repaired fences, moved through the hours as if she were invisible. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were commands, not conversation. She hated him for it, hated the life forced upon her. Yet at times, when the light caught his face just right, she saw something more, a shadow behind his eyes, a sorrow so old it had carved him hollow. One evening, as she scrubbed dishes by the basin, her hands red and raw, he came in from the fields. His shirt was torn at the sleeve, blood seeping from a cut across his arm. She froze, unsure whether to speak. He sat heavily at the table, gritting his teeth as he poured whiskey over the wound. Without thinking, she fetched a strip of cloth and moved toward him. He looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing, but did not push her away. Her fingers shook as she wrapped his arm, the warmth of his skin startling against her cold hands. When she finished, he muttered gruffly, "That'll do." Not thanks, not kindness. But something had shifted. That night she lay awake again, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. She did not know whether she feared him more, or the silence that stretched between them. She only knew that her life had been rewritten without her consent, and somewhere inside, a small spark of defiance refused to die. She would endure. She would watch. And one day, perhaps, fate would show her a path she had not yet imagined. The days on the Harlan ranch settled into a rhythm, though it was not one she would have chosen. At dawn, the rooster crowed, and she rose from her narrow bed to stoke the fire, her fingers stiff with cold. By the time the first light touched the hills, she had bread rising, coffee boiling, the kettle singing softly over the flames. He would come in then, boots heavy on the floorboards, hat in his hand. He ate in silence, his eyes fixed on the table. She tried once to ask about the cattle, about the fences, about the work he did from sunup to sundown, but he gave no answer beyond a grunt. After that, she stopped trying. The house was quiet except for the scrape of her broom, the crackle of firewood, the creak of the old rocker when he sat by the hearth at night. She hated the silence at first. It pressed down on her, reminded her how far she was from everything she had once known. She thought of her mother, her sisters, the sound of laughter at supper, and her chest tightened until she could hardly breathe. But out here, there was no one to hear her cry, so she swallowed her sorrow and kept her back straight. Yet, little by little, she began to notice things she had missed before. The way he rose before dawn to tend the stock, moving with the steadiness of a man who had carried responsibility too long to ever set it down. The way he stacked extra wood by the door before a storm without being asked. The way he left a lantern burning when he knew she'd be walking back from the barn after dark. He never spoke of it, never acknowledged it, but the small gestures were there, buried beneath his silence. She, too, began to carve out her own place. She scrubbed the floors until they shone, patched the curtains with scraps she found in a trunk, planted herbs by the window to season the thin stews she cooked. She hummed while she worked sometimes, softly, songs her mother used to sing. The sound startled her at first, breaking the stillness like a fragile thing, but she kept humming anyway. Once, passing by the doorway, she caught him standing still, listening. His expression did not change, but he lingered a moment longer than he needed before moving on. One afternoon, as she carried water from the well, her foot slipped in the mud. The bucket tipped, spilling half its contents. She braced for his anger when he saw the mess, but instead he bent to lift the bucket from her hands. His voice was gruff, as always, but softer than she expected. "You'll strain your back carrying it full." She blinked at him, the words catching her off guard. It was not tenderness, not yet, but it was something closer to regard than dismissal. Still, she could not forgive him, not for buying her, not for the life she had been forced into. At night she lay awake, watching him from across the room. He slept in the chair more often than the bed, as if distance was easier than closeness. His face in the firelight looked tired, worn by years of loss she did not yet understand. She wondered if he had once been different, if time and grief had stripped him down to this quiet, hardened shell. A storm came late that spring, tearing across the hills with a fury that rattled the windows. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolled, and the roof groaned under the weight of rain. She huddled in her bed, trembling with each crash. When the wind howled hard enough to shake the walls, she heard him rise. He checked the shutters, threw another log on the fire, and paused at her door. His shadow lingered there, long and still. For a moment she thought he might step inside, might speak, but then the boards creaked as he moved away. She buried her face in the shawl and whispered into the darkness, words he would never hear. "I don't know who you are." and I don't know who I'll become in this place." The storm passed by dawn, leaving the land washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. She stepped outside barefoot, the grass cool under her toes, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something like peace. He watched her from the porch, arms folded, face unreadable. She met his gaze briefly before turning back to the hills. Neither spoke, but in the quiet between them, something unspoken shifted. A thread stretched thin, but strong enough to hold. She was still his unwilling bride, and he was still a man older than her father. But the land had a way of wearing down sharp edges, of shaping strangers into something closer than they intended. And though she would not admit it aloud, she wondered what fate had in store for them both, here on this lonely patch of earth. The days stretched longer as summer settled in, and with it came a heavier weight between them. She worked the house until her hands were raw, cooked meals that often went untouched, and still felt like a shadow in her own life. He spoke little, and when he did, it was about the land, the weather, the cattle. Never about her, never about himself. One evening, curiosity clawed its way past her fear. As he sat at the table sharpening his knife, she asked, "Did you ever have a wife before me?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. He froze, the whetstone held still against the blade. For a long time she thought he might not answer, but then his voice came low, flat. "I buried her, along with 2 sons, long ago." Her breath caught. She had expected anger, maybe silence, but not this raw confession. His eyes did not lift from the steel, yet his hand trembled just enough to betray him. She wanted to ask more, to know their names, their faces, but the pain in his tone silenced her. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing for the first time that his silence was not only hardness, it was grief that had carved him hollow. The next morning she rebelled. She had grown tired of moving like a ghost in his world. When he returned from the fields, he found her with his ledger open on the table, trying to read the numbers scratched inside. His jaw clenched. "That's not for you," he said. "Then what is?" she demanded, surprising even herself. "What am I here for, if not to know the life I've been tied to?" For a moment he stood there, breath sharp, eyes burning. She thought he might shout, might strike her. Instead, he slammed the ledger shut and left the room without a word. The door rattled on its hinges as it closed. Her chest heaved. She had not meant to defy him, but the silence, the distance, it had worn her down until she felt smaller each day. She wanted to hate him, to remind herself that she had been sold like cattle into this life. Yet part of her ached, too, because behind the fury she had seen something else in his eyes. Fear. That week the air grew thick and hot, storms brewing on the horizon but never breaking. The land grew restless, and so did she. One afternoon, she slipped away to the creek that wound through the back pasture. She pulled off her shoes and waded into the cool water, letting it run over her ankles. For the first time since her wedding, she laughed softly, a sound carried on the breeze. She did not realize he was watching until she turned. He stood on the bank, arms folded, face hard, but his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. Embarrassed, she stepped back onto the rocks, tugging at her skirts. "I just needed to feel alive again," she whispered. Something broke in him then. Not anger, not scorn, just a long, tired sigh. He walked down, knelt by the water, and dipped his calloused hands into it. The sun caught the scars on his forearms, old burns and cuts from years of labor. "I come here when it gets too heavy," he said quietly. "This creek was the last place I sat with my boys." Her throat tightened. She wanted to reach for him, but fear held her still. Instead, she asked, "Why bring me here, then? Why force me into a life I never chose?" He lifted his gaze, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of his sorrow. "Because I was already dead in all the ways that mattered. And when your family offered you, I thought, maybe a body beside me would keep the ghosts quiet." The truth hit her like a blow. He had not chosen her out of cruelty, but out of desperation. She turned away, her eyes stinging. It did not excuse what he had done. It never would. But it painted him less as a monster and more as a broken man trying to survive. That night the air cracked open with thunder, and the storm that had been building finally came. Rain pounded the roof, wind howled through the cracks, and she sat by the fire, shivering. He came in dripping wet from securing the barn, his shirt plastered to his chest. Without a word, he pulled a blanket from the chair and draped it over her shoulders. His hand lingered a moment longer than it should have, heavy, warm. For the first time, she did not pull away. Silence filled the room again, but it was different now. Not sharp, not empty. It was fragile, like glass that might break if touched. And in that silence, she realized the line between hate and something else was thinner than she had ever imagined. She still did not forgive him. She still could not. But when the storm passed and the fire burned low, she lay in bed awake, listening to his steady breathing in the chair across the room, and wondered if fate had indeed placed her here for a reason she had not yet begun to understand. The days after the storm felt heavier, as if the air itself carried the weight of unspoken words. She moved about the house with a quiet determination, tending to chores with stiff shoulders, while he worked the fields longer than usual, his silence sharper than any blade. Something had shifted between them that night, but neither dared name it. By the third morning, she made a choice. She packed what little she owned into a cloth bundle, an old dress, a ribbon, the locket her mother had given her before she died. At dawn, when the sky was only a gray smear of light, she crept from the cabin and headed down the dirt road that led east. Each step made her heart pound, but also breathe freer. She told herself she was not a wife, not a prisoner, not someone to be traded. She was still her own, if only she could escape. She did not make it far. A shadow fell across the road, and she froze. 3 men rode toward her, dust rising beneath their hooves. Their coats were worn, guns heavy at their belts, eyes sharp and cruel. She clutched her bundle tighter, pulse racing. "Well now," one of them drawled, reining his horse in close. "A runaway bride, ain't that a sight?" Her throat closed, fear clawing at her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet rooted in the dust. The second man leaned forward, sneering. "Looks like she don't belong to anyone. Maybe she belongs to us." Before she could move, hooves thundered behind them. He came like a storm, his horse kicking up dirt, his rifle steady in his hands. His voice cut through the air like iron. "She belongs to no man but herself. Leave." The riders shifted uneasily, eyes narrowing. The leader spat into the dust. "You're old, Reed, worn out. Why should we walk away?" The rancher's hand did not shake. His eyes did not waver. "Because the next sound you hear will be the crack of this rifle, and I don't miss." For a long moment, the road held its breath. Then the men cursed, turned their horses, and vanished into the haze. She stood frozen, her bundle clutched to her chest, tears burning in her eyes. He dismounted slowly, lowering the rifle. His face was hard, but beneath it she saw something else. Fear, not for himself, but for her. "You were leaving," he said quietly. It was not an accusation, but a wound laid bare. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I thought if I stayed, I'd disappear. I thought you only wanted me because you'd lost everything else." His hand tightened on the reins. He stepped closer, his voice rough with something she had never heard before. Pleading. "Maybe that's how it began. But it ain't what it is now." Her heart hammered, her throat dry. "Then what am I to you?" He hesitated, as if the words themselves cost him more than blood. "You're the only reason I wake up with breath in my chest. You're not a replacement. You're not a ghost. You're the first chance I've had at life in 15 years. The world went still. The weight of his confession hung between them, heavy as stone, fragile as glass. She felt the truth in his voice, and it broke something inside her. Anger, fear, the belief that she was nothing more than a bargain. But she was not ready to forgive. Not yet. When they walked back to the cabin, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, alive, filled with words neither dared to speak. That night, as she lay in bed, she touched the locket at her throat and wondered if fate had not bound her to a stranger at all, but to a man whose wounds mirrored her own. And for the first time, she prayed not for escape, but for clarity, to know if the life she had been forced into might one day become the life she would choose. Autumn rolled in, painting the hills with fire and gold. The ranch seemed quieter now, though work never slowed. She moved through the days with steadier steps, no longer just a shadow in the house, but part of its pulse. He gave her space, never pushing, but his presence was constant, beside her at meals, in the fields, at the creek where the air always seemed softer. Still, the wound of how she had come here lingered. Some nights she stared at the ceiling and told herself she should leave once winter passed, before roots tied her down. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw his hands guiding hers through the soil, heard the gravel in his voice when he read aloud by lamplight, felt the warmth of the blanket he had draped over her shoulders that stormy night. Then came the fever. It struck sudden, laying him low in bed, his face pale, his breath shallow. She sat at his side through nights that blurred into days, pressing cool cloths to his skin, coaxing him to sip water. He muttered in delirium, names she did not know, his wife, his sons, and then her own, spoken like a prayer. She held his hand tighter. "You're not allowed to leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not after everything." When at last the fever broke, he woke weak but alive. His eyes opened to her face bent over him, weary, tear-stained, but steady. He tried to speak, but she hushed him. "Rest," she said. "I'll keep watch." And she did. Through each fragile step of his recovery, she stayed. Not because she was bound, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because the thought of this house without him was unbearable. One evening, when he could finally stand again, he asked her to walk with him to the porch. The sun was sinking, painting the land in red and violet. He leaned on the rail, his voice still rough. "I need to say this plain, before it festers. I never should have taken you the way I did. I was drowning, and I grabbed hold of you like driftwood. That was wrong." Her heart pounded. She braced for the words that would cut her loose. "But," he went on, lifting his eyes to hers, "these months have shown me something I thought was gone for good. I don't want a ghost. I don't want a prisoner. I want you, only if you'll choose me." Tears blurred her vision. No demand, no bargain, no chain. Just choice. She thought of the day she had been sold, of how small and powerless she had felt. She thought of the men on the road, of his rifle raised to shield her. She thought of his hand burning with fever, clinging to hers as if she were the last tether to this earth. And she knew. "I should hate you," she whispered. "I tried to. But somewhere along the way, I began to see the man beneath the grief. And I can't walk away from that man, His jaw trembled. He reached for her, not with urgency, but with reverence, as though afraid she might vanish. When she stepped into his arms, it was not surrender. It was a vow spoken without words. The months turned to years. Snow fell and melted, crops withered and grew. She stitched her laughter into the walls, her care into the soil, her strength into every corner of the ranch. And in time, love took root. Not the sudden kind, but the slow, enduring kind that grows through storms. One spring morning, she stood on the porch cradling a child in her arms, a daughter with his dark eyes and her quiet smile. He came beside her, calloused hand resting lightly on her back, eyes full of something softer than she had ever imagined. She looked out at the hills, the same hills she once dreamed of escaping. Now they felt less like prison bars and more like shelter. "I never thought I'd call this place home," she said softly. He bent his head, pressing his lips to her temple. "Neither did I, until you." And under the wide sky, where sorrow had once ruled, they built a life not of bargains or chains, but of trust, of choice, of love hard-earned and fiercely kept.